Welcome to the Labyrinth. I'm Anna Pirelli. Now, if this is your first visit to the Labyrinth, then you won't have seen the other videos in this series. This is part 5 of a whole series on emotional intelligence and raising emotional awareness. So I do recommend and encourage you to look at the other videos as well. The links will be in the description. If you're a returning visitor, then I'm assuming and hoping that the content that I'm providing, especially in this series, is beneficial to you. Anyway, today we're going to look at emotional mastery, and the way that this is, you may as well say, the way that we gather this is through implementing a number of skills and strategies that are part of what is referred to in industry as dialectical behavioural therapy, which is referred to as DBT. Now, of course, when I deliver this particular video, I'm drawing on my training and skills, having done my Masters of Counselling, or at least the what do we call it? The academic content. I never did, just to be clear, I never did my prac on it. So I haven't completed that degree, but I have actually completed the Bachelor of Social Work. And I did, as part of my training, working with people that are unwell, I actually did complete additional and further training in DBT. So anyway, where I'm going with this video is going to talk about DBT initially and explain what it's about, the pros and cons, if there's any cons, and then we're going to look superficially at how it works so that you can then conduct your own research and work out what works for you. I will be providing you some resources that I've found along the way, and certainly my preferred resource. And I wouldn't restrict myself just simply from accessing this content simply because you don't have a clinical diagnosis or whatever. The content that I'm going to provide to you will actually help everybody, regardless of whether they've got really strong emotional dysregulation. Basically, these are skills that I employed myself along the way, okay? It's all part of evolving and developing ourselves. So anyway, without further ado, let's get cracking. So what is DBT? Okay, DBT is a therapy that was developed by Marsha Linehan in the 1980s, and she was trying to develop something as part of an intervention for reducing people at high risk of self-harm. Specifically, we talk about the S word here. So it was to minimise risk of that happening, because that was the field that she was working in at the time. Now, my understanding, it may not be correct, but I suspect or think I read somewhere that she actually suffered from emotional dysregulation herself. So what she did was she developed this therapy that basically people with these conditions say that mainstream therapy doesn't work for them because it infers to them that there's something wrong in their head and that their feelings aren't real. So this particular therapy is focused on validating their feelings. Their feelings are real, they definitely happen. And so it's about teaching people emotional awareness, when to recognize their triggers and how to intervene themselves, and ultimately to create emotional independence, if we like. Now, the therapy, what I find to be different between or an observation that I've made, is there seems to be a focus in modern times on delivering DBT in group work, and a lot of people aren't aware that they can actually do a large part of it or a large component of the therapy as part of their own activities. The group activities are actually there for them to practice the new skills that they get as part of doing DBT. So just to be clear here and point out that when it comes to emotional dysregulation and other illnesses such as schizophrenia, there's often a trauma component to these conditions. Excuse me, stumbling over my words. I'm trying to be very careful what I say and make sure that I convey a professional approach to this. So where we're going with this is the evidence supports that for many people there has been trauma in their childhood, and some of that trauma can be really horrible. There are questions about whether or not the conditions are hereditary, if there's a genetic component, but there's no evidence to suggest this. At the same time, is it learned behaviour? Are these emotional dysregulations things that they've learned from their parents or a consequence of the parenting styles. But more and more evidence, as I understood when I was doing my research, is that they are simply survival skills for these people based on whatever is going on for them. And I don't know how effective DBT would be for people who have got a drug-related psychosis, but this is perhaps something that family and caregivers could research themselves. So the benefits of the condition, and I'm really, just to remind you, I'm going to try and spin through this. This is a very simple introduction to how DBT works throughout this video, but the benefits are evidence-based, okay? It is effective. It's not suitable for all people. Not everybody, I'm trying to remember my teachings and my lectures. Look, it's not going to work for every single person. There is no therapy that works for every single person, but the evidence is there that supports that it is very effective for the largest group as far as emotional balancing goes. It will improve, it is evidence-based to improve the quality of an individual's life, to reduce anxiety, depression, trauma, and stress symptoms. It decreases, I'll use the S word, I'm not going to actually say it there, you can see it, that and self-harming thoughts and behaviours. And it also carries with it positive results as far as the person. I use the word consumer there because that's an industry word. This is the people that use therapeutic services. Anyway, it increases a person's self-worth and self-respect, and I think person is a far nicer name. So while I do put a disclaimer in with my videos that any of the content that I provide should not be considered to be professional opinion because of the fact that I no longer have professional registration or anything like that, which means, just so that you know, I don't stay up to date on current research and that kind of thing. And this is really important when it comes to therapeutic statistics and remaining current on what's happening within the therapeutic environment. So what I did, instead of doing research, I actually did a quick Google to see what's happening. There is currently a little bit of controversy around DBT and the practical nature of it, because there appears to be a group of consumers that are saying, one, it doesn't work for me, or it didn't work for me. But then when they say that it didn't work for them, they offer suggestions of when, or examples of when it didn't work for them. And it would appear to me that it didn't work for them because there was either an issue with the person, the therapist, or what we call the therapeutic relationship, or because it was in a group setting where they were uncomfortable. And what I've seen is a little bit of sort of finger pointing at Marsha Linehan by clinicians, saying that the only reason it had this great success was because she's very charismatic and she's got a wonderful way of engaging her clients, which I find to be very interesting, having done training. And I'm going to do a little bit of opinion piece here in regard to these clinicians, because I'm trained in the field. That if that is their answer to DBT is not effective because it's only effective because Marsha Linehan's a great person, then they need to go back, take a look at their books and their academic studies and see what it says. It doesn't matter what the therapy is, if there is no healthy relationship between the person, the client, the consumer, if that's what you want to call them, and the therapist, then the therapy is not necessarily going to be successful, or it's going to have very limited impact on the person's life, because what they have established evidentially is that the success of a therapy is largely related to the relationship between the therapist and the person. And when I've encouraged people in the course of my social work to engage with a therapist, this is when I was doing field working in human services, I used to say to people, look, go and see a person. It's not one size fits all. Just because you don't connect with a therapist doesn't make them a bad therapist. It just means they're not a good fit for you. So give it a shot, but give the person a fair shot. Give them about 3 times. If it's not working for you, then get another therapist, right? I'm going to talk about, actually on the next slide, what I consider to be the reasons behind why these therapies have been ineffective for people. So in my observations, and I became very heavily involved in trying to upskill clinicians and organising training and that kind of thing for people, because my pathway into mental health actually was because I was part of a pilot project that delivered the S word interventions. We had a major problem with S in the areas that I was living, especially with youth. So what we did was we tried to intervene, and I've always been passionate about improving things for young people as well and not having them become a statistic. So I then became involved in coordinating, not training. I wasn't the trainers. I organised training events and attended a lot of training in regard to putting in place interventions for this very vulnerable demographic. And what I observed was, because there is such a lack of expertise out there, that you would have, because the government was trying to do a massive push to get clinicians upskilled, you would have clinicians attend these training events that actually were just there to puff out their CV. So that's the first thing that I would say, is not everybody that's gone into this and not everybody that carries a qualification is actually what I would consider to be suitable or qualified to lead these kind of therapies. And this is largely because they don't actually have that willingness to understand what that experience is for the person. Now, I'm not saying this to say that these people or these clinicians are bad people. We need to remember that everybody develops at their own rate, and if it's not part of their pathway, it's just not part of their pathway. And you can talk until you're blue in the face, but if somebody's not really willing to understand, then this goes for the same with clinical training as well. So there's an absence of qualified people out there. And then the other thing is that in regard to group delivery and service problems, there's a couple of aspects with this. Most of the group work is actually done through government agencies. Now, when we talk about government agencies, and I should say this is a good reason why I'm not part of my professional body anymore, is because we actually are told that we shouldn't be telling people stuff like this. Well, from my perspective, I think that to withhold certain relevant information is disrespectful to the people with the illness, and it's important that they know and understand so that they don't personalise things, okay? When it comes to government services, they're reliant on government funding. And when it comes to government funding, there's a whole heap of check boxes there where everything becomes depersonalised. It's very clinical. It's about how can we get services to the most amount of people in the briefest amount of time and in the most costly and effective way. So government services tend to deliver a lot of group programs. And while group therapy is recommended when it comes to DBT, it is recommended at that point where people have got a certain level of skills and strategy. If they go back to the basics of how DBT is to be delivered, the person has time to work on their self-awareness before they go into that group setting and practice their skills, okay? The other thing that is a problem for delivering groups is down to administration. Okay, so I know this from when I did my own units on group work, is that we must take into consideration, in the first instance, a group should only be about 6 to 8 people, especially with these kind of problems. By the way, I'm mentioning this because I've seen that there is an online group talking about how DBT is a problem and it should be banned and this kind of stuff. But all of their problems, so these are people with borderline personality disorder, from what I've seen, all of their problems have occurred within a group setting. So I think it's really important for them to understand that these now they're biases, they're biased against DBT, which is a wonderful tool for them. And it's just so frustrating for me that they have walked away from this and are like, DBT offers nothing because of a bad experience within a group setting or with their therapist. So if they can shift past this as not being reflective of the therapy itself, but rather about the therapeutic relationship and the delivery of the service, they will understand more. Okay, so when a group is created and put together, there is an administrator that puts it together. Now, once again, we're talking about not necessarily having the right person for the right job, because when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about betrayals of trust, and these people are highly sensitive, and it's got to be a very well-planned group. And if they don't plan it properly or check the criteria and that kind of stuff, it can be very difficult for all the participants in this group to feel comfortable and safe to talk about the things that bother them. So I would hazard a guess and say there's been a mismatch with the participants, the group participants, and there needs to be some level of similarity so that the group members can build connection and participation, so that they can feel comfortable to share their experiences and not worry about having somebody minimize or invalidate their experiences. So I'm just putting that out there before we get into it, because I just think DBT is the best thing since sliced bread, to be honest, and I would love to see people use it. Now, just to be clear here too, you don't have to have a mental illness to be able to benefit from it, and I'm going to keep reiterating this. I'm going through it as if it's delivered to people with this emotional dysregulation, because I think if I don't do it this way, I'm doing it an injustice, and I'm doing people an injustice as well. But just remember, at the end of the day, the resources I'm going to provide you are ones that you can adapt to your own situation. Anyway, moving on to the next slide. So, work that a person can do on their own without being in a group, as far as DBT goes, is they start to recognize what their triggers are and how they react to their triggers. Okay, so we all get triggered in different ways. The way we manage them is different. Okay, somebody that is triggered and becomes reactive is offered a choice at this time frame. And it's about, am I going to live by judgment, how I interpret what I assume, am I going to compare myself? We'll look at all of this stuff, or you can go and do your research, reassessing and looking through other people's eyes, right? Am I going to judge myself within this, or am I simply going to take the mindful approach and notice the feelings and sensations and explore the facts before I actually do any major reactions? Right, so we have that choice there. Now, if we're going to, what I like about this particular diagram, it shows exactly what happens once we've reacted to something. We can regulate ourselves, that self-regulation, and you'll know with this, that fight, flight, shutdown, alteration in mood, and this is that shutting down business. That can be when you're triggered, but you manage to control your anger and you suppress it and internalize and that kind of stuff, rather than lash out at people, because the initial reaction generally involves lashing out at the people around you who've triggered the response. Okay, self-regulation is about getting control over that, whereas emotional regulation involves accepting the emotions as messengers, and we've talked about that in the other emotional intelligence videos, and then taking the opposite action to that which we would like to do, and we breathe and we ground ourselves before we respond to whatever the trigger was. So this is the beauty, or the essence, of DBT. So rather than spend a lot of time on this particular video, I'll just remind you that I gave a video, I think it was last week, on how to use the Gibbs reflective tool as part of unpacking emotions and feelings and situations and identifying your triggers and that kind of thing. If you go back and look at that one, you're going to see how this plays into DBT, because it is about recognizing your emotions. In the first instance, because it's DBT, we would take a look at a situation. We wouldn't look at a current one. We'd look at one from the past, and it would be a case of where you felt very overwhelmed and you had a lot of emotions, and then you would describe it. What happened, where has it happened, who was involved, all of that stuff. And then you go down to what you think caused the situation, because what you think caused it is going to shape how you feel about the situation. And this is very important to the DBT process. So just be really honest with what your thinking process was like during the time and what you think caused the main aspects of the situation. Now, there is a variation between what I put on the previous video and the process of DBT, because in this instance, when we're talking about the thought, we're actually exploring the thought part of it as well, which we didn't do on the previous video. We just explored the emotions. We didn't look at what was the underlying thought. Why would I think that my brother wasn't interested in hearing what I was saying or whatever. Where did that come from? So that's part of this whole process of DBT and unpacking, because it's an assumption. It wasn't correct. I made an assumption and I had an emotional reaction to it. So anyway, that's the whole point of how we would go through this. Now, I would recommend, I'm going to have some resources in the video description as well for you to really go and unpack this bit a bit more. I might even, yes, I will. That's what I'll do. So the idea of doing this journaling is because then you can actually really take a look at it and think, well, what is it that I want to change? Where might I have made an error of judgment in my thinking? Okay, so for example, I suppose I may as well refer back to obviously the experience that I outlined last week, which was I made the assumption that a person didn't care about me because I had made some erroneous actions in the first instance, and I personalised it because I was experiencing distress at the time. So the idea of journaling is so that we can look at that scenario and go, well, what would I do in future? So this was the next stage of the Gibbs reflective framework where we go, what can I do in future? Okay, it's about setting goals, and these goals need to be effective. Now, of course, we're talking to emotions in multiple scenarios on this video. It's not just about an incident perhaps occurring. Maybe somebody is completely emotionally overwhelmed and suffering from anxiety, depressive type disorders at this point in time. So it would be a case of, well, let's take a look. What are the emotional goals? What do I need to do to feel better about myself? And the first part is actually to set a really small goal to start with. So let's say that you've got significant depression or whatever, and everything is too hard. And of course, I've worked with a lot of these type of people as well, where simply getting out of bed becomes a chore and looking after their personal hygiene or whatever. So that becomes a goal, right? Okay, I'm going to set a goal. I'm going to have a shower each morning, you know what I mean? And then the idea is that you do it. So that's the first step. I'm just really simplifying this here. Obviously, not everybody's going to be down that low. The other good thing about doing this, the reason why I've put SMART goals up here is because this is really a very effective tool for people to be able to review, because part of emotional reward comes from looking back and seeing it in the hard, solid face of writing that says, yes, actually, look at that. It's almost like a star chart for adults. Look at that. I did it every single day. Or actually, I've been struggling with this one. They can self-assess as to whether or not their setting of goals is effective, if they need to change their goals, because if they're failing at a goal, right, let's say that the person, this is a really, sorry, no disrespect, but okay, this might be, I'll try and find another one. Somebody that perhaps is eating junk food on a daily basis and they want to have a healthier diet. So they might decide to set their goal as eating healthily. So they might identify through the process of setting a goal and having one healthy meal a day is not viable because they actually don't like going to the shops because they've got social anxiety and it's easier to do a home delivery or whatever. So they can then see by looking at their goal setting what are the barriers to them achieving their goals, and it helps them to really work out what works and what doesn't. So a simple short-term goal, right, for those people that are struggling might be just to start with a healthy breakfast. Stick to that for a week, and then build upwards if that's what they like, or if it's something they want to continue. Within a professional setting, what I did notice, so I don't know if any clinicians are going to be paying attention to this particular video. I wouldn't have thought so, but if they are, I would like to remind them that when the person is setting the goals themselves, and if I was supporting them to achieve their goals, quite often what I would find is that we would set a couple of small goals and then they would come back and tell me that they actually didn't achieve the priority one that we'd agreed on. And that was because things had changed and they had reprioritized. So, this is why DBT is brilliant. I'm about to say very good. No, I don't have a stutter. I'm just so excited about this to deliver it. It is fabulous, right? It allows so much flexibility for the person. Okay, so as I say, you start with the small ones and then you start with the bigger ones. And the bigger steps would be, just designations of time and things that are fulfilling. It could be that somebody decides that they're going to do artwork. They might decide to do some physical study. They might, do anything that's up there that would be emotionally fulfilling. The key is that whatever these activities are that they set as goals, that they are emotionally rewarding and they help that person to feel good. And that's how we determine whether or not that goal setting is effective. Are they feeling good and better about themselves as a human being by doing these tasks? So, when setting your goals, of course, it's really important that you take a look at what your areas of vulnerability are, okay? And this means basically things such as here, review your lifestyle. Take notice or pay attention of just what is happening in your lifestyle. Now, don't forget that I did a physiology of distress series as well. I'll put that in the link too, because we have actually already discussed the impacts of inadequate sleep and exercise on our stress levels and addictions, because our body is a chemical being, okay? So if we've got a chemical imbalance in our body, it's going to automatically translate over to emotional discomfort of varying depths, of course. So when you're setting your goals, take a look at where you might need to implement some positive changes. And just incorporate them in small steps, remember? So DBT also includes what we call cognitive vulnerabilities. So where an inadequate diet can impact on our emotional well-being, cognition refers to our thoughts. It's the way we process information. It's what we think. It's the ideas that we have that can impact on our emotional state. And it involves self-speak. Now, I'm going to give you another big term here, and when I say big term, it's because it's not used in common mainstream language, and I think that it's actually helpful, or my belief is it's helpful people to understand clinical terminology, because it's like speaking a separate language. And I think I made a joke, to be honest, when I was at university. There was this business of, they said something about language, and I inferred it, and I believe rightly so, that the clinicians, it was like the inference that the average person can't understand clinical language or whatever. And I sort of thought, well, perhaps the issue is actually that clinicians are using language designed in a way that the average person can't understand. So anyway, I'm going to deliver it to you in a way that you can understand. When we talk about cognitive vulnerability and distortions, some of the time this is referred to as maladaptive thinking styles. And when we talk about maladaptive, we're talking about thought processing that has occurred over a period of time, and where it impacts negatively on us. And there's a number of ways. I'm going to be delivering a video series specifically to this to help people, but where it's beneficial, whether you're spiritual or not, is because it helps you to really reflect on, hang on a moment, how do I speak to myself? What is the idea behind my speech? What are the thoughts going on? Does this reinforce feelings of shame and guilt, and what can I do about it? A lot of the time, a cognitive distortion is a really unrealistic perception and interpretation of what's happening inside and around us. So there are a number of cognitive distortions, but I'll give you a couple here. There's all or nothing thinking. It's like black or white. This is the way it is, blah, blah, blah. If somebody didn't tell me, prime example, if somebody didn't tell me that I'm fabulous, they must think I'm a loser. So, now I'm all cut up and out of shape because they think I'm a loser. So that's a cognitive distortion. Another one is catastrophic thinking, and I'm not going to make it personal here. It's this real blowing things out of proportion. And a prime example, if you've been watching the media at the moment, Princess Catherine of the UK is hospitalised. There's been a public announcement made that she's going in for abdominal surgery and she'll need to have 3 months off work. interestingly, I mean, that's a normal process really for anybody that's had abdominal surgery. I think it's actually, I've known people that have received the same kind of outcome, which is you need 3 months off work, but they're generally all back at work before that time. But they just allow, I think, a bit of extra time for recovery. But when we talk about catastrophic thinking, the media just goes wild, and so do all these people going, oh my God, she's got cancer. You know what I mean? They jump to that, where it could actually quite simply be, not being rude about it, it could be fibroids. It could be anything. It's just they're playing it safe and they're giving her time off. And not only that, even if I'm wrong with saying this, we can't make assumptions out of words that people haven't given us. That actually is another maladaptive flaw that we'll be talking about. I think that's called crystal ball theorizing. Anyway, I'm not going to go into this too far here because I'm aware this will be a really long video and I want to keep it short. Okay, so there is also the way we look at things, how we process thoughts, and whether or not we overgeneralize. If it's happened once, it's going to happen every single time. That's an overgeneralization. So self-validation is a really core part of DBT. And when we talk about this, we're talking about people learning to accept and understand the emotions that they're experiencing, right? Because generally that whole internal conflict comes because people go straight into denial. They don't want to experience the emotion. And for example, if they're feeling sad or angry about something, a trigger, they will immediately turn around and tell themselves things like, I know I shouldn't feel like this, I should know better, right? So it's about accepting those primary emotions, because the alternative is it's really exhausting and very uncomfortable. So one of the things DBT is that it will learn to help you to validate your emotions, and it breaks it down into steps, okay, which is observe how you feel, observe your emotions, note them, acknowledge them. Where am I? Instead of saying to yourself, I'm feeling sad, I'm very weak, I'm unworthy, etc., you just go, don't put an explanation to it. I feel sad. Okay, you don't have to put a reason there for why you feel sad. You observe and you acknowledge that feeling. And then it's a matter of saying, you know what? It's okay to feel sad if you're overwhelmed. It is okay to have these emotions because they're telling you something. They are giving you a message. And the next part of DBT is obviously understanding what is it that your emotions are trying to convey. And that could be that, actually, I'm not abandoned, or I feel abandoned, or this emotion is coming because of abandonment in the past, but I am not abandoned right now, all of this kind of thing. But you will just remember, I'm glossing over this stuff. There's some beautiful links. I'm going to give them to you soon. So I'm not going to go into the detail of why these things are emotional myths, because this stuff, the content can be found online. But what I will say is there is a myth-blowing component to DBT, which looks at some of the statements that we tell ourselves, which is along the lines of, I should never let anyone know how I feel because they'll think I'm weak. Absolutely not true. Emotions are stupid and useless. Absolutely not true. They're messengers for us. If I feel something, then it must be true. Well, then I would say yet again, absolutely not true, because quite often our feelings, if we're talking about emotions as opposed to physical sensations, then sometimes we feel that something is love, for a prime example, but it's actually not love. Okay, it is sometimes the polar opposite. If I feel like doing something, then that's got to be the right decision for me. No, not necessarily. That's a myth. That could just be an impulsive behavior. I shouldn't try to change the way I feel because that means that I am being inauthentic. No, that can be unpacked elsewhere. I should feel what everybody else is feeling if they were in the same situation. No, not necessarily. Life is boring without drama and extreme emotions. Oh my golly gee. When I am impulsive and act on my intense emotions, I get things done, or I get more things done. These are all myths, and they can be unpacked by accessing the online resources that I'll put in the links in the video description. So, when we talk about balancing emotions, it's quite often about doing the opposing action to what that reaction wants us to do. So, the person feels the feeling, they're triggered. Perhaps if their normal response is to be, for example, to verbally or physically attack somebody, they actually do the polar opposite of that urge, because the urge is not the emotion, the urge is the reaction. And part of the balancing of emotions is building that sense of self and positivity. There's an emotional reward from not being reactive. People start to feel more empowered and more in control of what's happening in their lives once they learn to respond as opposed to react. So, balancing emotions is there. You can also research that on the links that I'll be providing to you. There's a far more comprehensive explanation of what balancing emotions looks like and what it feels like and how you do it. So, problem solving is also another phase of the DBT. Now, just to be clear, they don't recommend the Gibbs Reflective Framework tool that I recommend. I recommend it because I believe that it's suitable for problem solving and for developing emotional self awareness, because we can just adapt it and it really helps us to dig deep. So, within the context of this, briefly, it's just a case of identifying where there is a problem with an emotional response and it's a reaction or a trigger. Is it a recurring trigger? Is it something that has happened again and again? And how does it impact on your life? And what can you do to make sure that you respond to each scenario based on the current environmental situation as to opposed to the historical situations? And as I say, the links that I give you are going to allow you to dig deeper into this rationale and the therapeutic approaches. So, distress tolerance is probably best outlined on the DBT self awareness website. Okay, they really go into it as being the last phase of the DBT process. It's once a person has developed the capacity to observe the emotions along with physical sensations and to learn to feel emotions without actually taking actions upon them. They can sit with those emotions before reacting, so that they can choose responses. They can, how am I going to phrase this? Instead of reacting to situations, they choose to respond to them and create positive outcomes. So, this is a vital strategy that's not just one that's there for people with borderline personality disorder or emotional dysregulation. This is something, when we're talking about emotional intelligence and that find your tribe stuff, this is what we're all aiming to get to, this particular point. I should have mentioned on the previous slide that when we're talking about distress tolerance, we're also talking about exposure. And that's where the group therapy comes in, because that's about testing and challenging yourself to be able to see how you actually navigate and manage your emotions in a group setting where you might actually be triggered. And I guess if I was going to be critical about how services are delivered, this is what I think is potentially going wrong, and why people have complained about DBT is they're going into a group situation and being pushed to test their tolerance levels before they're actually ready to do it. But anyway, by the time we go into that group setting or testing our distress levels or testing how we manage our emotions in a safe environment, by the time we've done all of that, we're set up for the future. We've learned to master our emotions. We know what our triggers are. We know which DBT skill to apply for each trigger. This is all broken down very well on the resources. And a person is encouraged also, as part of developing this mastery, to practice it. Now, if I wanted to put it in really simple scenarios, and the basic situation that we see again and again, or certainly I've seen again and again, is probably with boundaries, where people struggle to say no. So, a skill that can be applied to that trigger, because that can become very triggering for people if they're saying yes all the time when they mean no. And then finally they get fed up with saying yes to people and they snap and they go berserk and they say, why do I always have to do it, or whatever. Instead of saying no because it's so uncomfortable for people, a skill or a tactic to get around saying no is, let me get back to you on that. Can I get back to you on that? Right. And then they can go away and practice how they're going to deliver the actual no. I mean, they could avoid it, but at the end of the day, avoidance doesn't solve the problem. It's being comfortable to say that no. So when they're put on the spot, instead of saying yes, if they're not comfortable saying no, they can just go, oh, yeah, look, I'll have to get back to you on that. Okay, very simple. So these are the skills to set you up for the future. So for the purposes of putting this video together for you, the resources that I've primarily relied upon, which are current websites online, is this one here, which is the one that's basically person-centered, consumer-led, the voice of experience. This website is the one that I recommend for anybody and everybody, regardless of whether or not you've got a diagnosis, because it's got some really good tools on there, and because it's coming from the person, not from the clinician. It's self-led. And look, basically, anything that you ever wanted to do with emotional regulation, you can find on this website. And this is the other primary resource for this video as well. Now, this one I suspect is clinically delivered, looking at what I'm seeing. I didn't check them out to see if they're all psychologists or whatever, but my initial reaction to this video is it's got heaps of resources. It definitely adds value. As far as clinical resources go, it's probably one of the better ones that I've seen. The problem is, if anybody from that particular website is watching this video, the problem that I see from the consumer perspective is it looks a bit cold. It's not really person-centered, I would say. It's just very flash and swish, okay? But anyway, regardless of how flash and swish that it is, it actually is still a very good website. It's kind of covered all the bases, and it is one of the websites that I'd be more comfortable to recommend to people to go to, because it actually looks like it knows its stuff. Plus, it gives you a lot of free resources. Now, I am going to put in the links as well, another resource for families and caregivers of people that have got a diagnosis of emotional dysregulation or other, because this is really important for them. They have a lot of challenges as well. And just in case you're not aware, there's a lot of resources online, including training from an organisation called NEA BPD. But just because it's got the word BPD or the initials added to it, I know through my training that clinicians are often reluctant to make a diagnosis of BPD or emotional dysregulation, and they will, if there was an unlimited access to funding, anybody that's struggling with emotional regulation would be offered an opportunity to access these resources. I will just say, though, with the NEA BPD, I did see that it actually does deliver services to people in the UK, but it looks like they're offering paid services if people are trying to access a therapist. And I think on this website you can access paid services. Now, I want to be clear here, I'm not endorsing either of these websites from a paid service perspective. I'm just saying they've got a lot of free resources on them, which will add value to people who are struggling to balance their emotions, or just for people that want to grow their emotional literacy. So I say they're brilliant websites. Give them a look. Let me know what you think. I'm happy about that. So, my friends, that concludes the entire series that I'm going to be dedicating to emotions. Next week, we're going to start looking at thought, the power of thought, through the process of exploring cognitive and maladaptive thinking, or whatever we want to put to it. But what else will I add here? If you've got feedback, if you want to add to it, this is a really brilliant subject. If you've got questions, write them up. If you've got feedback, write them down. Make a comment on the video, let us know, because somebody's going to benefit from it. You know, when we're talking about personal growth, we're talking about personal growth for everybody. So don't be too shy to write down and say your experiences. But you know what? You don't have to say your experience. I don't encourage that. I don't encourage you to put down your diagnosis either. I would rather see people turn around and say, well, actually, I know somebody who had this experience, because that way they're protecting themselves, their identity, their experiences, and don't name your family members or anybody else specifically if they have had problems or whatever. Don't disclose other people's confidentiality is where I'm going. In the meantime, I'm going to love you, leave you, catch you on the next one. I'm so relieved to see this series put to bed now. Yay. Catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.